So there we go. I'm starting to record. Right, I'm just going to turn my camera on for a few seconds so I can introduce myself so you can see me. Let's just see if it shares. Okay, go on and off. Share video. All right, I'm not sure if you can see me because my camera wasn't working, but hopefully it is working. Can you guys see me? Okay, perfect. So I'll just introduce myself to you. My name is Rebecca Wakeford, as I have let you know, and you've seen in your material, and I'm your online tutor for psychology. A little bit about me. I'm from KZN. I live in the beautiful KZN Midlands. I see there's someone from Hilton, which is awesome. That's close to me, so that's great. I am not a full-time tutor for Varsity College. I work for a non-profit organization, and we're involved in second chance educational models. So this is a second job that I have, and I do it because I love psychology and I love working with new students and helping them to get to grips with online education, especially in this discipline. Stella says I can't hear anything. I think you can. Can anyone else? Can you all hear me? Okay, sound is good. All right, Stella, it might be just a setting on your side. So I also, I've got an undergraduate degree in commerce. I've got a BCom, and then I went on later to study psychology. So I understand where some of you are coming from, that you're working students. I understand completely. I then went on to do my honors in psychology. I've got my honors in community health psychology. And what I really enjoy about that and working is there's so much of this discipline that can be applied to our everyday work environment and to our personal lives. So it's really interesting from a learning perspective, but it is also wonderful to be able to apply it, especially if you're an older student and involved in any kind of work that it works with people. I mean, it's very relevant to everything we do. So that's an introduction to me. I've got a daughter. She's 22. I love hiking. I love walking. I love being in the outdoors. So that's a bit about my life. So now I've introduced myself to you. I will just stop sharing my camera so that we save some bandwidth. And so I did put up a welcome video, and I hope that you have all had a chance to have a look at it. So it just saves some time going over the basics. But if you've got any questions at all, you are welcome to pop them in the chat. At the end of the chat, at the end of the session, you're welcome to raise your hand and I'll answer them, or you are welcome to send me an email. As I said in my introduction, is I correspond by email and I also correspond through VC Learn. I don't get involved in WhatsApp groups. So if you have set up a WhatsApp group in between yourselves, you are more than welcome to do so. If there's someone who wants to put a WhatsApp number up on the screen, if someone's running that group, I'm also happy to take it down and share it with anybody else who asks me. So that's how I work. Basically, I will try to respond to your email within 24 hours so I can get back to you. Unless it's over a weekend, it takes a little longer. But I'm here for you. I'm here for you to ask me questions. I'm here for you to ask for help. But please, whatever you need from me, I will try to give it to you. If it's a question about Varsity College and your material, then it needs to go through the VC Learn Assist process. But anything directly related to the course content or challenges with the course, then you are welcome to email me directly. Okay, is that clear? And hopefully you guys will email me. I've spoken to a few of you already. Some of you guys are getting to grips with the material, and that's awesome to see you also enthusiastic. I've got two groups for this particular module. Some of you are in group 1, some of you are in group 2. There is another tutor who has groups 3 and 4. So you're a big group altogether, probably about 200 students. So when you do email me, if you could possibly put which group you're in on your email, so when I need to look for your marks and your grade center and any queries you have, I know where to find you, because I also lecture the second semester module as well. So I work with a number of groups. So please, when you do contact me, just let me know which group and which module you're doing. All right. So just because I didn't have it in the introductory section, I just wanted to show you, I speak a bit about ICE tasks, and I know that you have had sessions with other online tutors for other modules. So just to let you know, the ICE tasks are tasks that are embedded in your course material. You'll see when you look on VC Learn, there's a whole lot of tasks within your learning units. And there's some of the tasks, one in each learning unit, 1 to 4, that has been labeled as an ICE task. And that is the task where we look to be able to see that you are managing to engage with the course material we give you, and that I can give you feedback on prior to assessments to help you with any challenges you're having. The ICE activities are also loaded for you under More Resources. So under the More Resources folder on the left-hand side, you'll see ICE activities, and that will give you the link straight through to those particular activities. There's also a link for online tutor recordings, where after the session, usually the next day, not straight away because it takes a little while, I will upload the recording of the session under online tutor recordings, and they're there for you for the duration of the course. So your ICE activities have all been loaded under that heading, ICE activities. If you want to see what it looks like, there are 4 specific ICE activities in this module, 1 in each of the first 4 learning units. I haven't got a set date for when ICE tasks need to be in. They just need to be in before the CAS mark is calculated in May. But my suggestion is that really you need to complete them in the week that you're finishing studying this material. So I think the first guide I put down is that the first ICE task should be done by about the 17th of March, so that I can mark it and give you feedback. Otherwise, you'll end up with too much work to do. Once we hit assessment time, it gets busy. Once we start planning for our exam, it gets busy. So the ICE task is really to show that you're engaging with the material and that I can give you feedback. So that's where you'll find the ICE tasks. And please submit them to the best of your ability. And somebody asked me if they need to reference in the ICE tasks. You do need to reference in the ICE tasks, because it's really important to understand how referencing works in psychology, and you will be marked down in the assessments and the assignments if you don't reference correctly. So it's a starting point for you guys to practice your referencing, and we can correct any technical errors that you've got in your referencing. And as I said to you in the introductory video, in psychology, we don't use Harvard referencing, we use APA. And I have put up resources for you for APA referencing. There's not much difference between that and Harvard, but there are some slight differences or nuances you need to know. And so there are plenty of resources available to you to learn how to do it. And if you've got any problems or feel any nerves regarding referencing, then please contact your online information assistant, because they are wonderful in terms of supporting you. So that's something we need to get right in the beginning, so that we can get it all 100% by the time the exams come, and we are really looking at correct referencing, both in-text citations and bibliography lists. So those are your ICE tasks. As far as I know, your learning module says it's a take-home exam. So if anything changes, I'm sure they will let you know. And I will make sure that I let you know. It doesn't matter. If you want to go and change it, you can go and change your ICE task, Jacinda. You can go in and edit it as many times as you want. So you're welcome to go and change it. Okay. So hopefully the introductory video is all done and dusted. That's what an ICE task looks like. So that's your first ICE task that's there. And you will see that often an ICE task is done as a blog, or an entry where you need to comment on somebody else's. So it doesn't mean that you just submit your own work. It means that you'll have access to other students' work. And if you can make a comment, some of the ICE tasks require you to make 1 or 2 comments. It's really important, because we're not together in a classroom. We're working in an online space. So it's a way that we can actually work as a group and share information. If we want to share ideas, you can put it in your blog comments. So please note at the bottom of your blogs that it's not just your blog entry. They also want you to have a look at other people's blogs entries too. And that's how we learn. We learn from each other. All right, so I think that's enough of an introduction. If anyone's got any challenges, you're welcome just to pop them in the chat. If I don't see them now straight away, then we can just go back to them at the end. Right, so our very first learning unit, and I did ask that maybe you could go through the chapter prior to this session so that you have an understanding of what we're going to be talking about. But this first learning unit is really just an introduction to psychology. It's about how psychology evolved. We look at some of the different theorists and some of the approaches to psychology. So it's really just to orientate you towards some of the things that we're going to be learning about during the course of the semester. So welcome to Learning Unit 1. Okay, at the beginning of your module outline, within your module outline, each learning unit is provided for you. And in your module outline, there are specific learning outcomes. So those are the things you really need to focus on to make sure you understand, because you will be assessed on learning outcomes. So you need to just make a note of each of them. And when you finish going through the chapter in the material, go back to the learning outcomes and make sure that you can do what is requested of you. So you need to be able to provide a comprehensive definition of psychology. You need to provide a brief summary of how psychology developed. You need to be able to briefly explain some of the contributions, etc., etc. So when you work through your material, keep an eye on your learning outcomes, because that will guide you as to what you're going to be assessed on. So I hope that's clear. It's nicely laid out. In some of the further modules, there are specific page references, but in this section, you need the whole of chapter 1, but focus on the specific learning outcomes. Okay. Right, so let's get into now what the discipline of psychology is all about. So psychology started through basically philosophical questioning, not in recent times, many hundreds of years ago. They were philosophers, great philosophers who had questions about people's existence, people's well-being. There was also physiology, which was medicine. And those two sort of founding areas of philosophical questioning and physiology came together with scientific reasoning. And it's really important we understand the scientific part, and we will come to that as we work throughout this unit. The scientific part is important. And coming together, the merge of philosophical questioning of physiology along with scientific reasoning led to the discipline of psychology being established. And psychology comes from two Greek words. The first one is psyche, which means the soul, and logos, which means the study of a subject. So it's really about the mind, the mental processes, and behavior. And we will learn that psychology is an ever-evolving discipline. Right back from, as I said to you, many hundreds of years ago, up to where the first laboratory for experimentation was established. And between then and now, psychology is still evolving all of the time. And the definition of psychology does change. Okay, as psychology as a discipline has evolved and grown, it starts to look at more and more matters and issues, how things are interrelated, and so the definition changes. But in general, it's about understanding all the things that we do. All right. Excuse me if I just have a little cough. So it's really important to understand that psychology is a science. So like your sciences of physics and chemistry, it is a scientific study. It's not subjective. It's not things that people make up from nowhere. It's all about experimentation. It's about research. It's about collaboration, people putting their ideas together and coming up with theories based on scientific study. And the things that we specifically study is it's a study of the mind, it's a study of mental processes, but mainly it's a study about behavior, why people act and behave in the way they do, bearing in mind that the mind and mental processes have an influence on people's behavior. So psychology is a science because it follows the empirical method. That means that it's a scientific study that investigates things. Okay, so not what it studies or when the research was done, and certainly not by who did the investigation. It's determined by the method of investigation. So it's all about objective measurements and precise measurements. It's not subjective. You'll see many experiments that people do which say exactly what they're going to research or look at and how it's going to be measured. And they look at those results, and that's what determines the outcome of the research that they're doing. So they're not quite as precise in their measurements as things like physics and chemistry, but we use empirical evidence all the time to support what we're stating or what our theory is, or to support our research. It's all done by way of investigation. And you see that when we start to read, and we'll see journal articles, research studies, and that's an important part of the work you do, is finding the evidence to support what is being said. It's never subjective. You as a student never say, I think that. You've got to say, the research that has been done shows that. And it shows that because these were the results of the research done. Okay, so we use very systematic methods, and we look to identify, analyze, and describe things like the mind, the mental processes, and behavior. So it's really important to understand that psychology is scientific. It's not subjective, and it's not up to us when we write our assignments to say, I think that. What you've got to say is that the evidence or the research informs what I'm about to say. Okay, so that's why it's important to understand that it's a science. So as a science, we have our goals, which is to describe something, to explain something, to be able to predict. And you'll see that psychology, by looking at your research and what is done, you can then generalize it to a bigger population to predict something, and ultimately you can use it to modify something, to modify a behavior. So that's what the goals of psychology is. It's to be able to describe what's happening, to be able to explain why it's happening, to predict what might happen, and to allow people to modify based on what the findings of the research have been. So the core components of psychology, the things that we really look at that form the fundamental pieces of what we study, is the mind, the human mind, which is sort of, it's a bit of an abstract concept, but it's in the brain, and it's what fosters human consciousness. It's where our mental processes happen, thoughts, memories, perceptions. We can't see it, and that's one of the things we see with psychology, and we look at its evolution, is when we look at things, we need to be able to observe and measure. So the mind, we can't really observe the things that are in the unconscious. Okay, so it's networking skills in the brain that form associations, and it builds on existing knowledge and new knowledge, and that's what the mind does. The mental processes are the things that happen in the brain that need to produce a sequence of actions. Okay, so it's a mental process to developing towards some kind of outcome. So it's things like our thoughts are mental processes. Our memory is a mental process. How we perceive something is a mental process. How we learn is a mental process. How we reason about something is a mental process. And when there's a disruption in the mental processing, then you can have an affected behavior. So often what you see as an observable behavior that might seem abnormal, but it can be due to some kind of a disruption in a mental process, like a thought pattern or something. And the final core concept, which is probably the most fundamental core concept, is the behavior. And that's really what we observe. We observe the behavior, it's observable actions. And that's where the objectivity of psychology comes in. It's in looking at observable behaviors, which can be, they're very much dependent on mental processes. They can be responses or reactions to a stimulus. It can be something that's a response to a normal sort of circadian rhythm, like when you wake up. It's an automatic response. But ultimately, behavior is the outcome that we look and we study alongside the mind and the mental processes. So we'll look at definitions of psychology. We'll end with a definition of psychology, but there are multiple definitions, and you should be able to, by the end of this, be able to come up with your sort of own definition, drawing on these different themes and concepts that we've looked at. So when we look at psychology and we look at it as a discipline, It's evolved. It's evolved over many, many periods of time, and it's got deep historical roots. I've tried to put there, you can't really see, but it's not necessary. But it's just showing you how a lot of things are interrelated, how theorists come together and share ideas, new theories are formed, new ways of thinking are formed, but it has a historical basis, but it is evolving all of the time, and it develops all of the time. But at the same time, it is progressive. There are people researching more and more all of the time about people's behavior, but it's very fluid. Okay, it changes shape, it changes sort of perspectives, it changes fields. So just be aware that it's a complex thing in terms of what it's made up of. And you'll see that when we work through the material, sometimes you'll feel like you're in a bit of a history lesson. Sometimes you might feel like you are in a bit of sociology lesson. Sometimes you're in a bit of a maths lesson when we look at stats. Sometimes you're very much in a biology lesson when we start to look at how sensation and perception works, how the brain works. But all of those things come together to create the discipline of psychology. And within that, we have a diverse array of knowledge systems, from early influences right through to more recent influences. And it's sort of how we make sense of that information, how cross-cultural influences come in, environmental influences come in, different eras have different influences, but we're also sort of always developing towards frameworks for understanding something, often based on assumptions, but then we have to go and test those assumptions to come up with a theory. Okay, so it's made up of lots of widely accepted beliefs or principles that have been scientifically established. But it does create for a very interesting experience to study psychology. In some areas you might find more applicable and more relevant than other areas, but ultimately it will all come together as a whole. It takes a little while. And as you get deeper into studying maybe second year, third year honours or masters, you'll hone some of those down to specialist areas. But right in the beginning, we're trying to give you a sort of an array of the diversity of what happens in the discipline. Okay. So when we start to look and we start to speak about psychology as an emerging scientific discipline, Wilhelm Wundt was the very first sort of person to establish psychology as a science, and that was back in 1879, and he established a laboratory. And he developed really that psychology becomes a science. He had apparatus and he sort of measured immediate reaction times. So his focus was very much on consciousness, and you'll see we have sections on consciousness and we also have sections on unconsciousness. Some theorists look at unconscious like Freud, and we'll come to him, but behaviorists, for example, work more in conscious awareness. So his focus was very much on what's in our conscious awareness, what's in our immediate experiences. And he studied things like attention, memory, sensory processes, and reaction times. But it was really Wilhelm Wundt who established psychology as that all-important scientific discipline. Okay, so it's just understanding where psychology as a science developed from, that he developed and timed precise measurements around reaction times and things like that. Going on from him, and these schools of thought have changed over the years, and these were schools of thought that were established in the 1870s. Okay, the first school of thought was structuralism, and that basically says that it's a little bit like a physics approach, is that you have to break something down to its smallest components. So what is the structure built of? It's built of things like mental experience. That's what the mind is broken down on. And they were trying to analyze consciousness into its basic elements. And to do that, how do you get to sort of consciousness? They use introspection, which is people trying to look inside themselves and trying to analyze people's experience. So it was known to be part of experimental psychology, and it focused on the brain and different elements and different capacities. And then after that came functionalism, which was led by William James, which basically saw it was starting to look at behavior, and that behavior is purposeful and it contributes to survival. So he looks at the function and the purpose of consciousness. So instead of trying to look at it right down at its basic elements, he looked at what its purpose was. And he really drew from the theory of evolution, that the purpose of behavior is really for survival, Nuru, no, you can't download the PowerPoint, but all the slides will be in the recording. So you'll get them all from the recording. And that people's consciousness consists of a continuous flow of thought. So it's not static, but it is always happening. We're always thinking, thoughts are always moving. So he moved away from being the scientific-based research in a lab to focusing on how people behave and adapt, and that behavior has a purpose. So he very much left his imprint going forward onto behaviorism and applied psychology. So those two sort of schools of thought changed, and yes, top right there is a download button, but I didn't tell you that. Those schools of thoughts gradually after the 19th century sort of phased out as two schools of thoughts, two competing schools of thoughts, and we saw the emergence of some of the theorists. So now this is where it starts to speak, and what we do, these theorists that we'll talk about now, these are really theorists who are responsible for establishing specific perspectives on psychology. I'm a bit confused. No, because they're schools of thought. They're not contemporary theories. So they were two initial schools of thought. What we see now and what we'll move into is more to be the contemporary theory. So contemporary is really anything that's from the 20th century forward. So Freud started in the 1900s. So we're going to touch on some of these theorists. We're going to touch on the perspectives, but we're only going to touch on them because what you'll see in the material as we move forward is that you will revisit these theorists over and over again as we actually get into more detail. So what we're trying to do at the moment is just to give you a perspective of these different, an overview of the different perspectives of psychology. These theories, no, they're based on independent theorists who sometimes they come out of those particular schools of thought, but the schools of thought sort of died away and these independent perspectives were identified. Really, some of them do come, they take a little bit from the schools of thought, mainly from functionalism, but ultimately these ones that we'll cover now are our main pillars of psychology when we look at the different perspectives. So the first one is called the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective of psychology. And the founder of that was Sigmund Freud. I'm sure you all must have heard of Sigmund Freud. And he looked at unconscious motives and experiences in early childhood, which give rise to mental disorders and govern personality. So he was way back in the 1900s. He used a process of psychoanalysis to treat people with psychological problems. So that's a little bit like talk therapy, where he tries to get to the root. He tries to get people to sort of uncover what's in their unconscious, to look towards the roots of behavior from childhood. He looks very much at trying to see what is in the unconscious through using things like dream analysis. People reported back on what they dreamed, and he tried to interpret them. Slips of the tongue, people make Freudian slips that he also thought could reveal what's in their unconscious. His theories were very much based on sex and control of repressed sexual urges, and we'll come to that in a later section. But it is very sort of Freud, although he's well known, his theories really said there was no impact or account for spiritual culture or other influences. He didn't experiment as such, but he used individual case studies, and he also looked at his own internal anxieties and desires. So that psychoanalytic was using the process of psychoanalysts to actually try to get into someone's unconscious and to find what they've hidden and what they've repressed that is ultimately impacting on their behavior. Carl Jung was a theorist who followed on from Freud. We don't really cover him in this material, but I've just put him there because he was sort of the follower regarding analytical psychology, and he looked around archetypal psychology where people have a collective unconscious. So it's quite interesting reading if you want to read up a little bit on what Carl Jung followed on from Freud with. Okay, so that is our psychoanalytic sort of approach to psychology. Psychoanalysis is still used as a tool, but it's been evolved and it's been adapted since Sigmund Freud started working with it in the 1900s. Okay, our second school of thought is probably one of the most significant ones, and that's around behaviorism, which really came to the fore from about 1913 to 1920. And that's where really it's where that objective statement that only observable events can be studied scientifically. So that's really what the behavior is focused on, is what are the behaviors we see? That is what we need to study. Okay, and so the note about behaviorism, again, it speaks to the fact that theories need to be supported by empirical data obtained through careful and controlled observation of behavior and measurement of behavior. So it's concerned with what you can see as opposed to internal events like thinking and emotion. So only observable behavior can be objectively and scientifically measured. So the founder of behaviorism was John Watson, and he basically said that anything that you can't see, that can't be measured, really doesn't fit into the discipline. And he entered into a debate, and the debate is not really a debate anymore. It's accepted that we have nature versus nurture. And the people who believe in nature believe that behavior is determined by genetic inheritance, that you inherit certain characteristics and traits, and they go on to affect your behavior. Nurture says that behavior is determined by the environment we live in and the experiences we have. So two opposing sort of situations regarding behavior. Are we born like that, or do we evolve like that through the interactions we have with the people around us and our environment? Ultimately, where life sits now is that it's a mix between the two. There's often a genetic composition to behavior, but at the same time, there is a nurture composition, and often the two intertwine to create some kind of abnormal or behavior that's not considered normal. So he focused very much on the nurture debate, and he did some experiments around conditioning, where he could condition children into fearing something that was neutral. So I think he paired a white rat with a child, and he made a big bang noise. The child got a fright, and after that, everything that the child saw that was white, the child would be scared of. So it's about conditioning. The other theorist who we also come to study quite a lot is Pavlov, and you might have heard of Pavlov's dog, where basically animals were conditioned to certain behaviors through pairing something that has no relevance. A bone would make a dog salivate. A bell doesn't make a dog salivate. But if you pair the bell and the bone together, a dog will salivate, and then you pair just the bell on its own and the dog will salivate. So we're teaching people conditioned responses, conditioned reflexes. It's a process called classical conditioning, and we cover that in much more detail in one of our next learning units. So it's very much about the stimulus and the response. Okay, something happens in the environment, there's a behavior that's in response to that stimulus. It's about rewards and punishment. It's about modeling and imitation. And you can actually teach somebody to act in a certain way through conditioning their behavior. The big thing about behaviorism at that point in time is it really was extensively used on animals, because animals could be controlled in this kind of environment. So the use of animals in behaviorism was sort of the foundation of how a lot of this learning theory took place. And the other theorist who sort of focused in the prescribed book, they didn't cover Gestalt psychology on these slides, so I just wonder why. You mean omitted from my slides or omitted from the old book? I'm not sure which book you've got, but it's not in the latest version. We do cover some Gestalt issues when we get to sensation and perception and vision, but we don't cover it as a perspective to psychology in this particular book. So Skinner was the other theorist in behaviorism, and you will learn a lot about Skinner because I think our final unit is on learning. So basically he focused very much on behaviors that have a positive outcome are repeated. Okay, so it's a little bit like a reward. If you produce a behavior and you get a positive outcome, you will repeat that behavior. Or if your behavior removes something negative, you would also repeat that behavior. So he had a box that he put little white rats in, and if the rat pushed a lever, some food dropped out, so the rat was rewarded, so the rat would continually push the lever. He also put electric shocks at the bottom of the box, that if the rat pushed the lever, the shocks were turned off. Therefore, we're removing something negative from the environment, and the rat would continue to push the lever. So it's also about learning. It's called operant conditioning, and we're learning about behavior and how behavior can be changed through processes like classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So that's what behaviorism is all about. Okay, and we will cover that again in more detail. Humanism is a more recent school of thought or perspective, or a group of theories. And that really says that human beings are free, rational beings with potential for personal growth, and we're very different to animals. Therefore, there's no animal research in humanism. It's very much based around the individual. It's not really looking at what has happened in the past. It's actually looking on the qualities that we have and how we can focus on our potential and make changes. So it's very much got an emphasis on self and self-growth, and that everybody has the potential for personal growth. And people are driven, we strive to fulfill our potential till we get to a point where we've reached it. So it's very much client-centered. You take a person as a client, you engage with them, you listen to them very actively, and society as a whole isn't bad, but sometimes you do get bad people within the society. So humanism is really looking at those qualities that allow us to become the best people we can be, to focus on our ability to change. So a theorist very prominent is Abraham Maslow, and you might have heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we will discuss those. So basically they explain human motivation. Why are we motivated to do the things we do, and how can we be motivated to reach a point of self-actualization? So what Maslow said to us, he said to us, if our basic needs are unfulfilled, if we have no water, if we have no food, if we have no sleep, if we don't satisfy that need, we can't move on to our next, to fulfill our next needs, which is safety. So we can never reach a point of self-actualization, of understanding ourselves, until those prior needs have been met. So once we've got food, once we've got shelter, we can then be concerned about our safety. Once we're secure, we can then be concerned with love and belonging, then self-esteem and self-actualization. And that's the pinnacle, is where people need to aim to achieve, and that's what the process does. It helps you reach a point of self-actualization. Carl Rogers was another theorist in this area, and he said we have a self-image, how we see ourselves, and we have an ideal self. It's how we think we should be. And where there's a disconnect between how we see ourselves and how we think we should be, that is where you have people who have sort of problems. Okay, they're sitting in a space where they believe they're one thing, but they should be another thing, and so it creates a disconnect. So he looked very much at reaching people, reach that ideal self, helping them move out of, or helping them get to grips with their self-image, or move towards being a better self. And that's what Carl Rogers did in terms of humanism. So very much focused on the individual as a human, with thoughts, with feelings, that they're rational, and that we're all striving to actually be the best person that we can be. Then we just touch on evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology, we don't focus too much on it in this particular in this year, really. It's a more modern form of psychology, and it really starts to look at how the process of evolution has shaped our mind and behaviors. So if we look at evolution and we look at survival of the species, is that basically we're only surviving to be able to reproduce, and being able to reproduce enhances our success. So basically it says to us that all behaviors are trying to help us reproduce in order to survive as a species, okay? Which means things like adaptation, how we respond in a particular situation. We might be looking out for threats that could be harmful to us and risk our ability to reproduce and survive. Looking for the ability to work cooperatively in groups is also about survival of the species. Sometimes we can apply it to mating preferences. We might select partners that we see as similar to ourselves in order to ensure that the sort of survival of our species. And foraging for food, it's a survivalist to ensure we survive. So the evolutionary approach really says that behavior comes down through the ages. It's sort of part of our ability to ensure survival of the species and to be able to reproduce. And then the final part, or the final perspective that we look at, is the cognitive perspective. And really the cognitive perspective is that it sort of happened when computers were invented, and it again looks a little bit like the mind as a computer. Is about how people acquire, store, and process information. It's about thinking. You'll hear the word cognition, cognitive, a lot during this material, and it's where people, and we spoke about mental processes in the beginning, but it's where people have distorted mental processes, it can lead to abnormal behavior. Okay, so cognition means that we have more agency, we can control how we think. So thoughts and feelings are seen as more active in the process of behavior formation. Behavior happens because we think in a different way. We solve problems in a different way. We might have problems with our memory. So cognitive psychology looks at intelligence. It looks at how we perceive things. It looks at our attention. It looks at our memory. It looks at our ability to think and solve problems. It looks at language. It looks at many things that sort of happen within those mental processes. So individuals are perceived to process thoughts that determine if and how behaviors are to be carried out. So we don't just behave, we have a process which precedes the behavior, and that is what cognitive psychologists are interested in. They're interested in looking at the thinking and what is happening in the mind that's actually causing that behavior to happen. And then biological or neuroscience, that basically says that behaviors are a result of bodily structures and biochemical processes. So we have neurotransmitters that circulate in our body, for example. And so depression is as a result of an overstimulation of serotonin. We might have too much serotonin or not enough serotonin. So by taking an antidepressant, we can actually start to reduce the symptoms of depression. So depression does not necessarily come from cognitive thinking. It can come from an imbalance in various neurotransmitters. We've got hormones in our body. There's medication we take. There's also that issue around hereditary and genetics, that things are inherited. So that's what it really does. It says, what is the biological component of a behavior that's being experienced? So we try and analyze a behavior based on biology and neuroscience. And you'll see that when we start to study the brain in one of the following units, you'll see how that all comes together. We talk about sensation and perception and how different structures in the brain work, and how there can be, if you've got a faulty part of your brain is damaged, then you could have a behavior that is an inappropriate behavior. Okay, so that's what biological or neuroscience tells us. So there's an overview. So in your text, it says addiction can come from a number of things, and we cover that again when we start to look at further modules. Addiction can be it can come from learning. It can come from cognition, faulty cognitions. It's also what happens when somebody takes some kind of substance. It's what happens in the brain that changes, so they take it more. So there's all sorts of things we discuss with addiction, and it's quite an interesting section because I think it's very relevant to us today. So there's a quick summary of those different perspectives: the behavioral perspective, psychoanalytic, humanistic, cognitive, biological, and evolutionary. I think the table is from your textbook, so you can see how those different perspectives happen. So now those perspectives are still in effect, and there's interrelations between different perspectives. Sometimes there could be a behavior it overlaps with the biological, and people might work together with the two different perspectives to find an answer to the problem they're solving. So they don't operate completely independently. There actually is some kind of interrelation between those different perspectives. As research happens, you might find you need to dip into a different perspective and overlap it with the one you're working with. Okay, so that's just the table summary. And more recently, it does just focus a little bit, and we do a section on positive psychology and health and stress. Is one of the more recent areas is basically, it's called positive psychology. And to me, that's also very interesting. So it's based on the belief that we really as people want to, and should be leading and want to lead meaningful and fulfilling lives, cultivating positive emotions, strengths, and virtues so we can achieve the goal. So Martin Seligman developed a model called PERMA, which basically it's an approach to improving happiness. So positive psychology says we need to be happy. How can we be happy? How can we decrease anxiety and depression and stress so that we can increase positive emotions to make us happy, so we can live a pleasant life, a meaningful life, and a good life? Okay, so that's just a little, it's not really one of the perspectives, but it's just showing you how psychology continues to evolve with all sorts of new ideas coming in. There are some good courses. Yes, the Science of Happiness. There's one called Positive Intelligence. It's very relevant. And if you can find courses to do around positive psychology, especially when our stresses in life are increasing, that how we can actually find ways to lead meaningful and fulfilling lives through reducing anxiety and depression and stress. And obviously the impact that has on our physiological well-being is really good to have a look at. Okay, I'm always mindful of my time sometimes. So, all right, so the next section in the textbook, and you can really read this, okay? It's about psychology in Africa and in South Africa. So as we've seen, and as we've looked at the theorists that we've had and we've seen, what can we see? We can see that they're predominantly white, they're predominantly male, and they're predominantly middle-aged. And so historically, psychology has developed along that sort of Western initiative. But they've said that those theories could just be somewhat expanded to include everybody, which includes people in other countries, ethnic minorities, and women. But now, in more recent years, far more attention has been paid to the role of culture, especially because the world is now a smaller place. We travel, we have better ways of communication. So you can't take a Western initiative and just impose it on other cultures and other population groups. So what we're saying about psychology in Africa and in South Africa is there now needs to be a more evolved discipline that takes into account the African experience and the African culture. The same as you would with an Asian culture or anything else, is that you need to make them culturally appropriate. But in order to do that, you have to do research, you have to do things in the specific culture to see how those specific theories impact a population. So yes, it is very much social engineering is that. So in South Africa, and I'm going to ask you to read it because I'm not going to go into it. It's the historical development of psychology, but you can see how it was used in South Africa during apartheid. Social engineering very much during apartheid, how we change how people think and perceive people of color. Children are raised very much under the nurture banner to say this is how you view someone of a different culture. It was used in tools where they used it in psychometric testing to justify racial segregation. It was very much seen as complicit in apartheid, and right through to the marginalization of Black psychologists. So that is sort of its core root in South Africa is it was used as a discipline, a Western discipline, to sort of control a population. So it was very much social engineering, and it's interesting research and interesting reading. But over the more recent years, obviously we have developed our own wealth of literature. There's a lot of research that happens. And psychologists are very much of all cultures. A lot of our research is culturally based. It's based on our own specific socioeconomic challenges, because in a country like South Africa, we have got a number of challenges around education, around poverty, and all of those require their own research. So we've got a wealth of our own research that we have now developed. It's often underpinned by those theories, but it is now culturally appropriate, which is all important. So as we move towards Africa and as we move towards cultures, we have to say, well, should there be a specific African psychology? And that's what's been admitted even in textbooks. We've taught this very predominantly Western-based psychology, but now you'll see our textbook we use now has got South African research in. It's got South African examples. So it's very much now psychology that's grounded in African research. We have to look specifically at our own African philosophies. We have to look at our traditions. We have to look at our politics, our religions, and the social realities of the place in which we live. So all of those say that psychology as a discipline can be Africanized. And it should be grounded in the philosophies and cultures of the people that we work with. So it's also, again, very interesting reading, and I hope you pick that up from the material. And I hope when you do research, when we come to assignments, that if you can find research that's evidenced through South African literature, it's always a very good place to begin, to make it specific to us. So if you look at an African culture or a Zulu culture, look at the ancestors in the culture. Look how ancestors can have psychological influence on people who are being challenged by ancestors to do various things. They can be displaying certain behavioral abnormalities that can't be explained through some of these traditional theories. We have to go back to culture, we have to go back to heritage, and we have to say, well, why are people experiencing these abnormal behaviors? It's because the ancestors are talking to them. So we have to ground them in African knowledge and African practice and African culture. So the final, well, I think it's nearly the final part. Where do we go to with psychology? So again, I said to you, it's a really broad field. There's specific areas of specialization. So when you study this discipline, you're starting in your undergrad. I don't know how many of you are doing this as part of a general BA, or how many of you are going into another discipline, but some of you might want to be psychologists. So you can all go all the way through the process to become a clinical psychologist. That process is quite a long process because you have to do your 3-year undergrad, you have to do your honors, your masters, you then have to do your community service, and then you can register as a clinical psychologist. So you specifically treat psychological problems and disorders. But then you also have a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. So it's really important to note that they do a whole degree in medicine, and then they branch into psychiatry, and they can prescribe medication. A clinical psychologist can't prescribe, only a medical doctor can prescribe. So they look at similar things as clinicals, but they're coming from a branch of medicine. And we get neuropsychologists, we get counseling psychologists, we get educational who work in schools. We have people more and more who are involved in research. We have industrial psychologists. And if you don't want to go that far up the line, then you can always just become a counselor. You can get involved with psychometric testing. You can become mental health assistants. So there's a number of places you can go once you start to look at psychology, and employed throughout numerous sectors. They can be employed in business, in schools, in colleges, in hospitals, in clinics. So there's a nice website called Cognition & Co. If you want to look at some of the routes and some of the where you can go with this qualification, that's a really nice place to start. Because it sort of just shows you the progression. For those of you that are in it for a long haul, it is quite a long haul. Honors, masters, and then your community service, and then you become registered. But it's in your book. It just gives you a nice outline of what those different sort of occupations are going to do. I have a psychologist and a psychiatrist. I'm sure a lot of people do have both. And the psychiatrist deals more with being able to prescribe medication to counteract any abnormal behavior. So a psychologist and a psychiatrist might very well work in conjunction with each other. Okay, and then the final part, because we're nearly there, it's really just a summary of what we've seen, and it's a summary from the end of your book. So what it's telling us, and it's like I said to you right in the beginning, and these things that you hold on to, and you're going to hold on to them as we move through the chapters, because it will help the chapters make sense to you. Okay, that all the chapters will point towards the fact that psychology is empirical. So again, that it's scientific and knowledge must be acquired through observation. That we've just seen, and we'll continue to see it, that psychology is theoretically diverse, that there's many systems, many interrelated ideas to explain something. And we also see how psychology has a very big root in what's happening in the socio-historical context. So the social trends, what's happening at the time, what are the socio-political factors, what are the socio-economic factors. So as a field of study, as we move through the units, you'll see these different themes. They all come together, and we'll see them continually throughout the work we do. And related specifically to the subject matter, behavior is determined by multiple causes. We'll see that consistently. We'll see that behavior is shaped by cultural heritage, like I've just spoken about. We'll see that consistently. That hereditary, which is what we inherit through our genes, and the nature part, and the environment, which is the nurture, both together can influence behavior. And that people experience everything differently. Nobody is ever the same. That in every instance, there is always going to be a matter of subjectivity because everybody is different. So that's what we'll see, and that's what will hold the material together for you as we bounce all over the place, because it will sometimes feel like we're bouncing all over the place as we move through the other learning units. And then just to give you the final definition that it gives you in your textbook is psychology is a science that studies behavior and the physiological and cognitive processes that underlie behavior. And it's the profession that applies the accumulative knowledge of science to practical problems. So it is a science. It studies behavior. It looks at the mind. It looks at the mental processes. It looks at the physiological well-being to really look at why people are exhibiting a certain behavior. So I hope that gives you an introduction. If you've got any questions, you're more than welcome to ask me. I'm going to stop recording now.